Great. Welcome everyone to the session Energy Upgraded, Scaling Building Renovations for Decarbonization. For those of you that are looking to receive continuing education credits, either from the American Institute of Architects or another industry association, this is the description of today's session as well as the learning objectives. We will also be following up with a survey to collect some more information about your association and membership numbers to help you file your continuing education credits. And now turning it over to today's presenters and our moderator, Davina Rooney.
Well, thank you so much, Vincent. It's such a privilege to be here today and talk about one of my great passion areas about renovating and decarbonising buildings. And I'm joined here with a co-collaborator, Steve Ford, who's the head of sustainability and energy at GPT Group. So the way we're going to structure this 40-minute session is I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview and context on a little bit of the policy work that we do from an existing buildings. But then the next piece that we're absolutely going to run through is Steve's going to talk about some of GPT's journey. And the reason why it's so exciting for GPT to unpack this is a lot of people are talking about carbon neutral targets. Steve is going to be the first global portfolio who right now is delivering carbon neutral. And so he's really happy to talk us through his journey, the lessons learned, and importantly, some of the financial elements of those, which is really important as we all seek to take on these journeys together. So I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of this content. So to give you some context, I'm the CEO of the Green Building Council of Australia, and my role within industry is absolutely to partner to deliver healthy, resilient, and positive places. Now, when we talk about the role of the Green Building Council of Australia, we do a number of things. So we rate with our own rating tool, Green Star, which we partner with New Zealand and South Africa. We advocate within industry, and that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time unpacking. We educate, we partner in events like this, and we collaborate working across all the participants in industry so we can bring about the scale of change that we'd like to see. Now, when we talk about advocacy, I think there's two very different versions of it. There's how an entity like ourselves has the privilege to work with partners like GPT. So when we look at the advancing net zero trajectory areas, when we look at those, it's about how we work with partners to hit net zero by the World Green Building Council's goal is having those partners hit net zero by 2030, or excitingly in the case of GPT, certainly a lot faster in that context. And within our own market, within Australia, we have 19 partners, over 650 buildings that we're actually seeing take this commitment. And excitingly, Steve's from GPT talking through the wholesale office fund that you'll hear about. Now, when we talk through this context, I think one of the things that's really important is we're in a COVID context. So it's really important when we consider policy and advocacy that we really frame that for this environment. Now, I love the cartoon that I'm showing up there. It's from The Economist. So it's talking about the world, obviously, appropriately being highly focused on our, short to medium term fight against COVID. But importantly, there's the long-term objective and the long-term challenge of climate change waiting outside the ring. So when we're looking at economic stimulus and partnership in this environment, we really need to be looking and leading into what that looks like for the long term. So we really need to be encouraging government to have economic stimulus that works, not just for the short term, but also for the longer term. And so to give a little bit of an example of the work that we do at the Green Building Council in this context, I'm just going to share a little bit of advocacy work where we work with important partners in our jurisdiction, which is our Property Council, the Energy Efficiency Council, and importantly, the Australian Sustainable Built Environment Council. So in other words, a consortium of partners that we work with so we can seek to deliver this change at scale. And why is it important that we look at the kind of retrofits that we're describing? And that's because energy efficiency and the kind of retrofits that we're disclosing will create more than 90,000 job years of employment and have the potential to cut household and business energy by more than 4.8 billion, whilst delivering what we're all absolutely focused on in this conference, in this context, about how we deliver those critical reforms. So we've taken some long-term strategy work where we've been working with the government on how we deliver net zero within the economy, and taking the COVID context, delivered a short list of how we actually retrofit buildings and actually deliver great outcomes. And so I'm just going to unpack a few of those elements, and then we can seek to take questions as we move through the dialogue. Questions are open the whole time, so put them in your chat box, because once Steve and I start talking, we'd really love to unpack those with you. And so I'll pick a couple of the key initiatives that we think are critical when we advocate for change in this space. So firstly, having a really strong view of comfort and performance in residential homes is really critical. And we absolutely need to be focusing through targeted upgrades and incentives for deeper retrofits. So never have more people spent more time at home than in the last 6 months. And in the Australian context, we actually have more deaths from mild cold than Sweden. And that is because the quality of our housing isn't at a standard that actually delivers the comfort, quality and outcomes. We have to channel this time of COVID when people are spending a lot more time than they ever have at home, and really use this as an opportunity to lean into how homes can be better, and importantly, how we can do retrofits to make change. Another area, and Steve's going to talk extensively through this, is how we actually take the commercial buildings market and how we deliver that kind of change and enhancements through efficiency in that space. So one of the recommendations that we're working through with our government is the creation of a smart buildings fund, particularly to support the mid-tier owners who haven't made the scale transition into this market yet. Another key action is how we retrofit social infrastructure or hospitals and schools, and use the funding from the retrofits to really drive the outcomes at substantial scale. And, you know, so for ourselves, we're partnering with state government entities around the country to look at how we can deliver and implement some of these changes. And then returning to residential, if we can't measure it, we can't manage it. So within the Australian context, we have a world-leading scheme called NABERS, which the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, that we use to benchmark some of our energy performance in particular. And we use that extensively in office buildings in partnership with Green Star, that's used by the Green Building Council, which is ourselves. We work together to be able to manage and measure really clearly and really efficiently what change looks like in this space and how we deliver those incremental wins. However, within our residential market, we don't have an equivalent tool. And in that context, we don't see there being really strong incentives for there to be change, particularly in the renters market, which is of even greater concern because of energy poverty and the vulnerability of key stakeholders in that market. So actually working to have an equivalent measurement system to what's worked so effectively in our commercial property suite across residential is an area that we spend a lot of time working on. And at the moment, that's being deployed in our market through a 2022 review for an upgrade to the National Construction Code. So the next item is, with all these changes that we need, we need to work across industry as we actually scale and partner to deliver these kind of contexts, because, you know, if you're talking air tightness in homes, if you're talking about window retrofits in buildings, new air conditioning systems, energy monitoring, all of these spectrum of items, then you have to be really focused on how those are delivered with new skills. And this is really important, particularly as, you know, Australia's in its first recession for 30 years. This is a very job intensive economy. And when we deliver jobs in energy efficiency, they really meet the criteria of a financial stimulus. They're very high in terms of the numbers of jobs created per $1 million spent. The jobs definitionally are usually people who work locally to the building, so it's a good way to scale infrastructure. And research shows that they're highly likely to spend their money and reinvest back into the community. So it's really a double dividend. So when we're talking about COVID response, whilst delivering critical items through retrofits, we really need to position these on their societal and economic impact. So if we're going to deploy change, it's something that's actually delivered at scale. So I have talked and set a little bit of a policy context. We'll start to unpack some of that in the discussion as we proceed. And then what I'd like to do is introduce my partner, Steve Ford, to talk about GPT's carbon neutral journey, and then we'll seek to unpack some of that through conversation. So please send your questions in. We'd love to talk them through. So Steve, over to you to give us a bit of insight into GPT's carbon neutral journey.
Thanks, Dav. Can I actually just add a third dividend? So your double dividend, I want to turn into a triple dividend, Dav. It increases productivity, because in the future you get a dividend that just continues year after year after year after year. And that's actually a really nice sort of starting point for GPT's journey towards carbon neutrality. So whilst we signed the World Net Zero building commitment only a couple of years ago, I'd be lying if I said we started that journey a couple of years ago. We really started that journey well before I was on board in GPT. And it's been a long-term culture of our company to drive efficiencies and improve environmental outcomes. So we're at a company where we've been fortunate enough for someone to have the foresight back in 2005 to say, we're going to establish a baseline and we're going to work towards a long-term goal. And it is one of the things you brought up right at the start of your talk, Dav, is it is a long-term goal. Now, 2005 also happens to be the baseline for Australia's Paris targets as well. So it's a nice point where we could say we had very robust data and we really did start the journey in 2005. And it was always going to be a journey that was about improving efficiency, which has great business outcomes, but also improving the environmental outcomes. And carbon neutrality was on the agenda really early for GPT. And as you can see from this slide, as a corporation, so that's our offices, our management activities, our flights, our trips to and from work, GPT achieved carbon neutral certification as an organisation in 2011. So this year will actually be our 10th carbon neutral certification as a corporation, and it'll be the same year that we achieve carbon neutral certification for our first portfolio, the Wholesale Office Fund, which is a $10 billion-ish premium and A-grade office portfolio in Sydney, Melbourne and Brisbane. So it's a serious size office portfolio for Australia, and I dare say a reasonable size for anywhere in the world. So we had a continued journey, and a lot of it was about efficiencies and chipping away at through efficiencies, our carbon emissions. Until about, as Dav pointed out to me the other day, around 2012, we actually were one of the first large buyers in the property industry of renewable energy, so voluntary renewable energy purchasing. This was recognised not only through our own reporting in reducing emissions, but the NABERS scheme that Dav mentioned, the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, actually has a dual rating system. One is really focused on energy, which is the efficiency component, and the other one recognises the additional voluntary actions you take to reduce emissions through buying renewables. So that you would actually have an example might be, you might have a 5-star NABERS rated building, which was 5.5 stars with green power, which reflected an even better environmental outcome than just the efficiencies alone. We ramped that up to about 40% of our baseline energy contracts in 2014. And in many ways, whilst Australia had a phase of having a price on carbon and then not having a price on carbon, by having a premium on eliminating carbon, GPT has always had this baseline of like an internal price on carbon. It was a real value to us. So those efficiencies not only had the direct reduction in energy costs, but also the reduction in carbon costs as well, as we became more and more efficient. In 2017, as a company, we looked very hard at our carbon neutral targets. They were very long term, almost so far in the distance. It was a question as to are they serious and what are they really about? And I was really lucky to work with one of the leaders in this space in Australia, Bruce Precious. He led the GPT sustainability team at the time. I took a little bit of a holiday, more a sabbatical. And while I was away, Bruce managed to convince our company not only to reinforce its carbon neutral target, but move it forward to 2030. So it was in 2017 we established a 2030 company goal to achieve carbon neutrality. We worked with our wholesale office fund, and the fund manager there, Martin Ritchie, is another long-term leader in sustainability in Australia. Few people know, but actually way back in 2005, he was working in sustainability and moved on to run one of the biggest office funds in Australia, but never left that passion behind. So Martin actually spoke to Bruce and I said, how can we achieve carbon neutrality sooner than 2030? It seems a long way away for a journey that we started way back in 2005. We had established a large amount of capabilities during that time, from efficiencies to energy management to procurement. And Bruce and I worked with Martin to work out a pathway to achieve carbon neutrality by 2020, which at the time, I think we purveyed a lot more confidence than we probably deep down had, because in 2018, when we announced the carbon neutral target, as Dav would know, in Australia, the jury was out on how to actually even do your carbon accounting towards carbon neutrality. So GPT worked with a lot of counterparts, particularly Stockland's initially to get that carbon accounting piece right, but multiple different partners through the Property Council and Green Building Council of Australia to come up with what we thought was a reasonable way of actually validating carbon neutrality. And once again, it included the Neighbours Office as a verification pathway in Australia. So 2019, we developed GPT's Energy Master Plan, because we didn't want to only achieve carbon neutrality, we wanted to ram home that advantage we had in efficiencies and other ways that we were benefiting through our environmental journey on the financial side. And in late 2019, we ran a pilot to deliver our first 2 carbon neutral buildings. We're now busy rolling out that process through our entire portfolio. Got our first Queensland building in early 2020. We've just had another 3 buildings this week certified carbon neutral by Climate Active in Australia. We've possibly misled you a little bit, so I'll have to own up to this. We actually still have 8 days left before the entire portfolio has 1 year of carbon neutrality under its belt. So it's the 30th of September will be the end of the validation period for the entire portfolio. And then we'll go through the process of certifying for the first time another 12 buildings, all premium and A-grade buildings on the east coast of Australia, and recertifying those 2 pilots from last year as carbon neutral. So it's definitely been a journey for the Wholesale Office Fund, but it's been a journey that within our company, our other funds and our balance sheet assets have watched with interest. And I can tell you, if it was not a journey that was very successful, those other asset managers certainly wouldn't have jumped on board that train. And we're really proud to only have announced about a month ago that our balance sheet and our wholesale shopping centre fund, wholly managed assets, have also moved forward their carbon neutral targets from 2030 to 2024, starting with pilots for our shopping centres in 2022. There's still some validation pathway work to be done there. 2023, all wholly owned wholesale shopping centre fund assets will be carbon neutral certified. And in 2024, we'll wrap up the co-owned balance sheet for our assets and the balance sheet wholly owned assets for carbon neutral certifications. And then all that's really left for us is to work with some of our co-owners. And we know we can work with these co-owners because they've been with us on the journey. And every time, probably every second time we bring a new building to carbon neutral status, we're actually bringing one of our co-owners along for the journey with us, because there is a lot of co-ownership within the Australian property industry. So the likes of Keppels, AMP, ISPT, you name it, they're going to be alongside us getting carbon neutral ratings. So as those assets that they manage and we co-own in a non-managed sense are delivering carbon neutrality, we'll see the rest of our portfolio wrapped up between 2025 and 2030 by our co-owners. So efficiencies was where we started, and if we looked at the overall performance across the wholesale office fund portfolio, 45% of the inherent emissions from our 2005 baseline have just purely been eliminated through efficiencies. So it's actually a tad over 50% improvement in energy efficiency, but there are emissions from other sources than energy, so that's why it's reflecting as less than 50% of our total emissions. I probably should note that the boundaries that we're certifying under are scope 1 and 2, so all of our energy from gas and electricity, plus those areas under our control in scope 3. So most material of those are the waste contracts. We'd find it impossible to argue they're not under our control because we pay the bills. So, and waste to landfill is quite a big source of emissions. So, but 88% of those emissions in total are eliminated. So the first 45 through efficiencies, the next 43% are eliminated through buying renewables. And over time, we're going to increase that percentage of buying renewables by degasifying or electrifying our buildings, but that's where it stands right now. The rest we're dealing with through offsets. So, so we will offset our waste emissions from gas and transmission losses from gas and some small emissions from refrigerants, diesel and water. And we'll be offsetting those through land-based reforestation projects in Australia. So it all sounds very expensive, I can hear some of you saying. Absolutely not. And Dav, I've probably got my slides in the wrong order. Can we skip forward 2 slides?
Perfect.
And then I'll stop for a breath and a chat. So if we were to look at this just in the wholesale office fund portfolio, on an annual basis, those efficiencies compared to our baseline are saving us over $10 million. So it's a pretty good starting point in terms of your business case when you're $10 million up in your energy bills straight away. As energy is the second biggest source of operational expense in the average building, reducing your energy costs by about 50% through efficiencies is a really good pathway to take. The other thing we found through the process of heading down the path of buying renewables and looking at long-term energy trends and energy contracting, we've actually benchmarked our buildings against other competent managers. We feel there's a lot of competent managers out there, but by tweaking a few things we've done, looking a little bit longer term, in some cases progressively procuring, we've actually eliminated a whole lot of costs compared to other managers that we know are in the market at the same time. So annually we think conservatively estimating that to be around $2 million of savings. And then I'm not going to lie to you, there is a value to those renewables. There is a premium product and it has a premium value. And for the wholesale wholesale office fund, it's going to be around about $1 million a year for that, plus some offsets. Now, if you put that in the context of the overall plan, we're about $11 million a year better off. So we're reinvesting about 10% of the cost savings we're achieving into the values that have driven those cost savings. And I have been asked by some rather cynical people, well, can't we just take all the savings and not spend the premium to get the renewables? And I've said, yes, you can do that, but you will be looking for an entirely new sustainability team that's achieved all those savings, because we are not here to just talk the talk. We're here to walk the walk, and part of that is actually valuing those premiums. And overall, all of those capabilities we've built, with the drive to achieve carbon neutrality, with the drive to get a better environmental outcome, have got a massive windfall financially for us, and reinvesting a small portion of that back into the things that drive those values is actually really minor. So I might pause there for a little bit, Dav, and see if you've got any questions, or if you want me to go into more detail on some other things.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I would love to, I'm going to start with a few of my questions and then just see what we have from the audience. So, Steve, you and I have a shared passion for energy efficiency, you know, a little frightening for others. But, you know, you've talked about the 45% savings that you got through your efficiency projects. Can you please unpack those for some of our viewers? You know, just talk about what some of those elements are and talk a little bit about your journey, because for some of the groups who are earlier in their journey, it won't be as easy and they'll need to think through where they start. And for those of you on the call, feel free to pop in questions. I have a million questions for Steve, but I'd love to hear some of yours as well.
Okay, well, I'm going to start for something in a really simple form to say it's not rocket science, although the reality is there is a lot of potential rocket science in it. So to achieve those energy efficiencies, really, really simply, we turned stuff off. That was the starting point. And I've got to say, back in the early days, and you know, even these days, there is a propensity for things to go back to a state of disorder. Just staying on top of turning stuff off that's not needed is a massive part of your efficiencies. Sounds really simple. It is really simple, but you've got to make sure you maintain and put in place systematic processes to make sure only the things that need to be on are on. So that's step one. Step two, make sure things that are turned on are only turned on to the level they need to be on. So optimization processes, you know, particularly air conditioning systems. The number of times early, you know, in the noughties, we'd actually go into a building and find that we were heating and cooling the building in similar spaces at the same time, purely because of things that were sensors that were, you know, a $20 sensor could be wasting, you know, $1,000 a week in energy because you weren't doing things at the right level. So sensors, you know, VSDs, making sure you had controls and things were turned on at the right level. So pretty simple so far. Turn it off or make sure it's turned on only at the right level. And the final thing is just get more efficient gear. So that is actually the final step in. Don't go replacing all your gear for the most efficient stuff on the market if you don't have a life cycle upgrade opportunity. First, make sure you've got stuff turned off and controlled at the right level. And then the final step is, you know, efficiency upgrades where you genuinely change your lights, upgrade your chillers, you change your fans, you know, your vertical transport. But those are the three simple categories. And then over all of that, just like I mentioned on the turning stuff off, make sure you've got a systematic approach to measuring and monitoring, because believe me, even in the best company, you look sideways and don't keep on top of this, things are going to go back to chaos very, very quickly. They aren't in the bank, in a vault, those savings locked away forever, because buildings evolve. You know, you'll get a complaint from a tenant about, you know, air conditioning, and someone will want to go around and play with your building management control system. That's where it all starts. And then someone will play with it to fix it for someone else. Next thing you know, it's a disaster. So overarching those three things is a systematic approach to measuring and monitoring to make sure you maintain the savings.
Fantastic. I love that. Now, you've talked about, you've been on this journey for like 15 years. How do you take change management, deliver it, hold it for the long term? How do you make energy efficiency sexy?
Yeah, look, I'm still working on that. You know, it's
it's good to know even you still have a goal that you're working on, right?
Yeah, look, I've got to say, when COVID hit, it was a big hit to our industry. And, you know, we're an industry where, particularly where a number of parts of GPT was invested in, was going very, very well for a long time. And cost structures weren't, even though energy is the second biggest operational cost, we'd saved so much over time that there was a diminishing return or a diminishing excitement about the savings. When COVID hit, efficiency was the new black. Everyone wanted to know, how can we save money? And they turned straight to the sustainability team and said, not only on energy, but what other areas of the business have you developed capacity to sort of look at things from different angles and save money?
I think this is one of the secrets behind Australia's efficiency drive. People ask about how we have such sustainable buildings. One part of it is the great collaboration that we see in this sector, like we're sharing. But the other part is there's been a real focus on commercialising savings and talking about the returns in that space.
Yeah, and look, even if we didn't want to measure things, for example, in the office sector in Australia, it is actually mandatory for the buildings to be have NABERS ratings, and have it disclosed. So tenants, our ultimate customers, can actually assess from a NABERS rating, have a reasonable understanding, am I going into a building that is going to be operating efficiently, or am I going to have a landlord that is going to be wasting my money? Because ultimately those operational expenses pass on to tenants. So having that transparency has been fabulous, and the vast majority of our industry is very supportive of it. Hopefully we'll see a growth in that mandatory disclosure. And I do find it interesting in some areas where you can't go into a shop and buy a $500 fridge without a mandatory energy rating on it. But there are some people that think it's inappropriate to have transparency over the efficiency rating of a building that might have a $2 million a year energy bill. And that's realistic. Some of our buildings have $3 million a year energy bills. Imagine if we didn't have that 50% savings. That'd be $6 million or an extra $3 million that those tenants would be paying in operational expenses.
Well, Steve, I love to hear you talk about savings. So hit me with it. The total number of savings that GPT's experienced since the beginning. You're talking millions a year. What's the overarching number?
Well, for the wholesale office fund, which we take to carbon neutrality this year, we're at the same time we crack carbon neutrality, we're going to crack 100 million in accrued savings. So with our 100% renewable energy, zero emissions. But as the overarching GPT portfolio, and this isn't just from GPT's good work, this is from some of our co-owners that manage our buildings that we've invested in good work as well. We're cracking $250 million in accrued savings this year. So that's quite a significant contribution to the bottom line.
That is absolutely spectacular. Now, you've talked about collaboration with industry a number of times and peers. Can you just describe to me, people often talk about this market as being a market of leaders. Can you just talk a little bit about that enabling environment and what that looks like from your perspective as a co-owner?
Yeah, as a former collaborator / competitor, Dav, you'd know what it's all about. We do work really closely in this industry in Australia, and we've got the industry bodies like the Green Building Council, Property Council to help facilitate that. But we've also got the groups like NABERS as well. And there is this ultra competitive / collaborative environment where we all want to have the best tools to measure our performance. We all want to have the best performance. But at the same time, we know that, if, for example, one of my competitors improves their performance through new technologies, new techniques, they're creating a market in Australia of capable people that I'll be able to use in the future. And in fact, they will encourage us to, learn from them, because as soon as the market becomes bigger, it becomes cheaper for the original innovator as well. So, yes, we like to, get a few wins on the board over each other, but at the same time, we're really pragmatic in terms of, I don't want to keep this to myself, and none of my, collaborators, competitors want to keep it to themselves, because otherwise we don't grow the market and make it cheaper and easier for ourselves to keep doing this.
Mm. Now, you talked about electrification. A lot of the strategies for net zero are about highly efficient buildings powered by renewables is a real cornerstone for that strategy. Can you talk a little bit about, your reviewing in electrification and maybe unpack some of the difference between maybe new buildings, the challenges versus existing building? Because this is something we're having a lot of fun with in our market at the moment.
Yeah, so our carbon neutral plan is about efficiencies as the foundation, going renewable, and then at a certain point you have to offset unless you can shift your energy supply into something that's renewable. And there is no renewable gas market in Australia, and foreseeably there won't be for a very long time, if ever. So part of our plan is to, rather than it's a risk-based approach. If you take a risk hierarchy to dealing with hazards, you want to eliminate them first. And the best way to eliminate emissions from gas is eliminating gas and electrifying, because we buy 100% renewable electricity. It's getting cheaper, so the supplies are getting more reliable, but we have a role to play in that as well. In terms of our buildings, yes, if you design something from scratch, and most of our buildings now are the same as most of our buildings were 5 years ago and will be in the next 5 years. So there'll be the odd new premium office building we add to the portfolio. Designing that from scratch is far easier. You've got the appropriate pipe sizes, you've got the appropriate size coils, you've got appropriate ventilation, because you're going to need heat pumps that are probably air sourced, unless you've got some access to geothermal, which is not an easy access in the middle of a city. So that's all, engineering quite easy to do. But if you've got a retrofit to do and you want to electrify, it becomes far, far more difficult, because it's not just about replacing a gas boiler with a heat pump. The heat pumps take up a lot more space. The heat pumps need to somehow fit into the building, which might be on level 32. The heat pumps need appropriate ventilation around them. And then if you can even overcome those hurdles, then you've got to deal with the fact that the heat pumps at this stage are probably providing a lower heat. So to move that amount of energy around the building, you're going to need bigger pipes, in really simple terms. Now, your penetrations for your pipes running through your building are done usually once in the lifetime of a building. So you're talking, a once in 30-year whole of building upgrade if you want to, do a retrofit, or pricing in an extremely expensive, retrofit otherwise. You've also then got to deal with your coils for your distribution. So you've got a larger amount of heat that can, the air can flow over to distribute. So a lot of challenges. They're in some cases too challenging at this stage to overcome at a cost-effective result. And I would say the popularity of the sustainability team would drop if we didn't chew up 10% of the savings, but we chewed up 5 times the value of the savings in things that weren't feasible. And it's just not the nature of most sustainability people to be wasteful of anything, energy, water, materials, or money. So,
well, Steve, this is something that you and I could talk about for hours, but I'm going to have to hand back to Vincent to keep us on time. So to our audience, you've heard it there, a great combination of passion, technical and vision, absolutely coupled with the business case. And this is why we love retrofits in sustainability. So Vincent, back over to you.
Thank you, Davina and Steve. Absolutely phenomenal presentation, and the work that you're doing is absolutely incredible. Thank you so much for sharing with this audience here exactly what we would hope for in this teach-in, to show the way for all those that are following. So thank you so much for both of you. Wonderful dialogue and facilitation, Davina. Thank you so much. That is concluding this session. We're right at time. So I just wanted to note that for those that are attending, that the session will conclude, and that go back to the CarbonPositive website to find the links to the next session. There's one final breakout session set up for the teach-in, and then we have one final tool demo. So Thank you again to Davina and Steve for joining this wonderful session.